listening to the Betmaker Show. This is the college football team season futures preview for Thursday, August 22nd, 2019. And now, live from Las Vegas, the host of the Betmaker Show, Brian Blessing.
Well, it is at long last, finally, time to talk about games that will be played on a football field, college football. We've got two games on Saturday, Florida, Miami, Arizona, Hawaii. We finally get this thing rocking and rolling. The unfortunate thing, Brian Blessing in Vegas with Bruce Marshall, our good friend from the Gold Sheet. It's always great college information when we can lasso Bruce. I would say this, Bruce, can't wait to watch these games, and I can't wait till they kick it off, because between you and me, we've been talking about this for far too long, and it's the unfortunate thing for these four teams that they have the two games on the first night, and literally everybody's been talking about these games for months on end. So let these kids play some football.
Yeah, I mean, we've talked more about Florida and Miami than we did the national title game last January. Well, we only had a week run-up for that one, so we've talked a lot more about this one. And the strange thing is we've got a whole pretty full card the following week of games, and we haven't talked much about those yet. And there's a few good ones in that mix too. And these two this week, though, because they're first, have gotten an inordinate amount of attention. But let's kick them off and get the season underway.
I mean, the fact of the matter, though, Bruce, they'll probably get an inordinate handle on it because it's just those two. I mean, and people have been staring at it, talking at it. To that end, Florida, a 7.5 point favorite. The total on the game ranges from 47 to 48. So a little bit of a mixed bag on the total. But I guess from a development aspect, that number had sat basically 7 for months. And here in the week leading up to the game, the money's come in on the Gators, and it's gone through the key number.
Yeah, we talked a little bit about this earlier in the week, and I had thought at some point if there was going to be any movement off of 7, it might be up. Especially after Miami announced they're going with the redshirt freshman Jaron Williams at quarterback, after it appeared as if Tate Martell, the Ohio State transfer, was going to be the guy all offseason. He came in there in spring. Now he was adjusting in spring and didn't have a great spring, but most people down there seemed to think he was going to be the guy. But that's not the case. It's the redshirt freshman who will be taking his first snaps against one of the better defensive lines in the SEC, and a very aggressive coordinator on the other side in Florida's Todd Grantham. So, the question here for Miami, is the young quarterback, you're really throwing him into the fire right off the bat in this game, which is in Orlando, which is worth noting because even though it's a neutral site, the crowd, and from what I can gather, having been down there last week, it's going to be about an 80 to 85% Florida crowd in Orlando. So they're going to feel support like they're at home, although it's a neutral venue in Orlando.
Hey, the budget for our little soiree here is massive. We sent Bruce Marshall to Orlando just to experience the heat and humidity. What was the heat and humidity like at nighttime in Orlando? That was impressive. But Bruce didn't get the memo that actually, we're paying for that.
Well, there we go. That's always good. I know you guys are good about it. It was humid there, though, but compared to Las Vegas and hot, actually, it was tolerable, believe it or not. But I didn't have 80,000 people breathing down my neck like Florida and Miami will on Saturday either.
All right, let's focus on Florida. Obviously, a great regional game here, and always great for anybody if they can get a W against an SEC team, stamp that on their resume. But Florida here with Franks, the quarterback, there's the big question for Florida heading into a new season revolves around their offensive line. It's not a sexy position, Bruce, but honestly, other than the quarterback, that's the most important group that's out there, because if you can't run the ball and your quarterback's running for your life, you can't accomplish anything. And there are some question marks about this offensive line.
Well, yeah, they lost starters, 4 starters who made a combined 141 starts over the last 3 or so years. So that's significant. And though Dan Mullen, his offensive line coach, John Hevesy, is one of the best in the business. And they have mostly experienced guys coming in to replace him. Now, they played with some rotations last year, so some of these guys did get to play. They just weren't starting, so they're just sliding into the starting lineup. But you're right. I mean, that is the one concern about Florida, and this is an offense that really started to pick up down the stretch last year. Their last 3 games, the last 4, 35, 63, 41, and 41 points, and 3 of those were against pretty representative teams, South Carolina, Florida State, and Michigan. So they got the offense going last year, but now we've got to retool the line a bit. Dan Mullen, though, I think you saw his impact and his fingerprints all over this offense by the end of last season. His creative play calling. You know, he has some history with Manny Diaz, who used to be his defensive coordinator for a bit at Mississippi State, and now Diaz, of course, the new head coach at Miami. So these two guys know each other. But Mullen is a master game planner, and he does have an experienced quarterback in Felipe Franks, who's been in his system now for a second year. So I think these are advantages probably on the Gators side.
And as is the case with any new head coach for Mullen, you start putting your stamp on a program and start to get your own guys in there.
Yes, and I think that's what, down in Gainesville, they were so soured by what Jim McElwain, what happened in those couple of years, especially the last year under McElwain, that the whole thing went off the tracks, and they're hoping that Mullen can get this thing back on track. He's starting to get some of his recruits in there. He's butting heads against, the big boys in the SEC now. Well, he was sort of anyway at Mississippi State. I think that's the one thing Florida fans are starting to realize, that Mullen was able to keep Mississippi State punching above its weight, got them to number 1 in the polls for 3 weeks in 2013. And that was at Mississippi State in Starkville. He's got a lot more resources at Florida. It's a much better recruiting area. And if he was able to keep Mississippi State competitive, I mean, he should be able to do wonders here at Florida. And that's my thinking the whole way. I'm not sure Mullen was their first choice at Florida, but I think they ended up better off with him than anybody else they could have gotten, especially since he used to be an assistant coach there in the Urban era. And he was, of course, Tim Tebow's offensive coordinator at Gainesville as well.
For outstanding information and special offerings and promotions, we invite you and encourage you to sign up for our newsletter today simply by going to the website at betmaker.com. All right, for Miami, they get a shiny new toy. Diaz is the head coach, kind of a whirlwind. It went to Temple. All of a sudden, Mark Richt leaves. Diaz gets the job he's wanted all his life. So, good for him, and he's excited. The community's excited. But here, Bruce, in this first game, and he could go on and he could have a great career. But I think this really has to be part of the handicap. When you're donning the headsets and you're running the show for the first time, you've got 1,000 things on your plate. And I don't care who you are, there's a learning curve.
Absolutely. And we've been down this road before with many high-profile coordinators who become head coaches, and the transition doesn't work. And it's a different skill set, and you can't, you've got to be able to oversee everything and take a more broad look, and you can't get so much into the nitty-gritty as you normally would as a position coach or a coordinator. It's a different sort of nitty-gritty. And there's a lot of high-profile coordinators who have not worked as head coaches. That's why I'm reluctant to say Diaz is going to be a home run at Miami. Wait and see. It looks like he might be, but I've seen too many of these coordinators, highly decorated coordinators, not work. So that's the issue here at Miami, and it should temper their enthusiasm. Remember, Mark Richt was a Miami guy too. He had gone there, and he had played there in the Schnellenberger years. So, they were excited about him a few years ago too, and he had great success at Georgia as a head coach. Diaz hadn't been a head coach before, so there's still some questions, at least in my mind, and in a lot of Hurricane fans' minds, about how good this is going to work out with Diaz.
You and I worked together on another show over at VSiN, and in fact, we had the beat writer Edgar Thompson on from the Orlando Sentinel, and basically, this guy's on the front lines of this and been through camp. And I posed the question to him, and you can kind of elaborate on what he said. But I said the fact Diaz and Mullen are familiar with one another I said, is there an advantage one way or the other? And he did not bat an eye and couldn't say Mullen fast enough. And I think the more you think about it, it kind of makes sense in that, again, this is the first game this guy's coaching. He's trying to, get the players to buy into him. He's got to learn the players. So it would be a stretch to think that Diaz would be doing something exorbitant here out of the gate. He's going to go with what's worked for him in the past because he's got to, first of all, entrench fundamentals in there. And Mullen's going to know the things that he's always done that have really worked. And so maybe in that vein, that's why Mullen would have such an edge.
Yeah, and you're right. Edgar didn't hesitate. He said that would be the edge to Mullen. Now, remember, Diaz, I mean, he was here last year in Miami, so they're going to be running the same defense they did before. So it won't be much of a transition, at least technically on the defensive side. But you're right in that, Mullen, I think what Edgar seemed to be saying, too, was in this chess match between Mullen and Diaz, that it's probably going to be Diaz having to react to what Mullen's doing. That Mullen, he would figure to be a step ahead of what Diaz is doing here, and especially since he's got a quarterback now who is able to execute what Mullen wants. And I think that plays into it some, too. Having an experienced quarterback is probably a plus here for Mullen as well. But you're right. Edgar thought that would be advantage Mullen. Mike, I think, and he brought up the example of what happened last year in the LSU game when he said that was Mullen at his best, and he had kind of turned Dave Aranda, their coordinator, into knots by the end of that game. And he thought, in any of these matchups, Mullen usually has an edge. We also saw that certainly in the bowl game last year against Don Brown's very, capable Michigan defense. That was also turned to knots by Mullen. So he's a creative play caller, and he's in his element there at Gainesville.
All right, the game I'm really looking forward to, the get-out game, Saturday night. Arizona is at Hawaii. Arizona, an 11-point favorite. The total on the game, we're seeing 74. And before we dive into the specifics of both of these teams, for weeks and weeks and weeks on end, I had no doubt with both quarterbacks who were massively injured for stretches of last year. Everybody healthy at the beginning of the year. I thought this had track meet city written all over it. I think it likely is still the case, but we always talk about conditions. It's Hawaii. Oh, yeah. Okay, wait a minute. The trade winds are going to be blowing. At least that's the forecast. 19 mile an hour steady winds. It's not the end of the world, but that's a healthy wind. And that means there'll be, some gusts you would think in the 30 mile an hour range. And Bruce, doesn't matter where you're playing. We talk about rain and snow, and here's a game in Hawaii. At the end of the day, wind is the thing that can impact pace of play more than anything.
Yes, and that could impact a team throwing the football some, and Hawaii, throws it a little bit more, although, it'll be a lot of short stuff that they throw, but you're right, that could impact things. In Arizona's case, in their best case scenario, they would hope that wouldn't slow them down, though, because they think they can run on Hawaii, and that's what I think they're going to try to do. But you're right; it could change, the flow of the game for sure. But we'll just have to see how that part unfolds. More interestingly, here was what you brought up about the quarterbacks both being hurt last year. In McDonald's case, on the Hawaii side, he was putting up massive numbers the first month of the season. And then he had all sorts of injury problems, and he was playing through most of them the second half of the year, but he wasn't the same. In Khalil Tate's situation, he hurt an ankle in the second game of the year against Houston and wasn't really the same the rest of the year. I mean, he kept playing for most of the season, but he didn't quite have that burst that he had the year before. They did, however, change the offense. They were not running Rich Rodriguez's spread option, more of just a pure spread, what Sumlin has been doing since his A&M days and even his Houston days, and Noel Mazzone as offensive coordinator. And we saw the opener last year against BYU. That wasn't the same offense they were running the year before with Rodriguez. So I think that's the concern Arizona people have, even though Tate was hurting last year. He also wasn't running an offense that seemed perfectly tailored to him when Rich Rod was the head coach 2 years ago. And I think that's going to be the question Arizona has. And their hope is that they're just going to be able to overpower Hawaii up front and just run with Taylor, who's a pretty darn good back, and really control the ball on the ground and probably pop some big gains. So that'll be their game plan in this one Saturday night.
Well, the impact for Arizona, I mean, listen, Tate having a bum ankle is almost as bad as him having a busted thumb on his throwing hand. I mean, this guy 2 years ago was one of the most electric players in the game, but it basically revolved around him tucking it and running. And that also impacts the passing game, because if you've got linebackers and DBs that are kind of in no man's land protecting against the pass, but knowing that he's just as likely to run and produce a 30, 40-yard gain. Once he became one-dimensional, what he could do was just diminished massively. But him being healthy at the beginning of the year, I think, is one of the big stories in college football, is to see, can this guy bust back on the scene the way he did 2 years ago?
Well, you're right. I mean, he was being talked about as a peripheral Heisman candidate before last year. And 2 years ago, he was Pac-12 Offensive Player of the Week 4 weeks running. I mean, you don't see that too often. So, I mean, he wasn't a perfect offense for him. And there were designed plays in the Rodriguez offense for him to run. In the Sumlin offense here, most of his running is going to be improv, which would seem to be down his alley or up his alley. But it's mostly they're in the pocket. They run a traditional spread, and then maybe he's going to try to escape from there. But the design of the offense was still a little bit different than it was when Rich Rod was there, which was perfect for a guy like Tate. But he's got a big time runner there. I mean, Taylor ran awfully well last year. He ran for over 1,400 yards. So they've got weapons. One note though, they've got a pretty brand new receiving core here. And they're going to be starting at least one freshman, maybe two. So they've got some new targets here too. So maybe we're going to have to see Tate run a little bit more out of the pocket for Arizona to function well when it does design and set up a passing play.
And let's real quick go to the Hawaii side of things. McDonald, the first month of last year, and I honestly, they did a good job of kind of keeping it under the radar. I mean, the guy actually had internal bleeding. I mean, he was just banged up. But that first month of the season, they were as electric as any team in college football, and they go with pace. And you're right. I mean, it's not like every pass is, this 40-yard bomb, but they were so adept at hitting 12 to 15-yard slant patterns, hitting wide receivers in motion, right in stride, that they'd bam, Bruce, right down the field. I mean, it'd be like a 7-play drive, but it would only be like 2 minutes, 2.5 minutes would come off the clock. And then the one thing that does come into play, when that offense is clicking, it also means Hawaii's defense is on the field a lot more. And so when Hawaii's offense is working, it's a double-edged sword in terms of the total.
Yeah, you're right. And they had some of those games early last year. The CSU game, the Navy game, the Rice game are really just like ping-pong matches. And you mentioned the start that McDonald had last year, his first 3 games last season. Talk about breaking out of the gate quickly. He accounted for 15 touchdowns, 13 passing, another couple rushing. So he was on his way to a monster year. But then, he had some significant injuries there, and he missed some time. They do like the backup Cordero, who comes from the same high school on the islands there as Marcus Mariota and Tua Tagovailoa from Alabama. And he came in and bailed them out and won, actually, the Wyoming game. It was a lower scoring game. So, I mean, McDonald's been pressed a bit, but he's going to be the guy. The big thing for Coach Rolovich is he kept his entire staff intact for the first time. And it's only because it's so expensive to live in Hawaii. It is very, very hard to keep your staff there. These guys come in for a year and then they see how expensive it is and leave. But he's kept his staff together, which is people in the Mountain West tell us it's an enormous benefit to Rolovich. And you can understand that. There's more familiarity, and that's something Hawaii hasn't had in recent years, but they do have this year.
All right, great information. We're ready to kick it off. A couple of games on Saturday with Florida, Miami, Arizona, and Hawaii. And we've got more coming your way from our friend Bruce Marshall, the Gold Sheet, diving into the start of a brand new college football season.
Let's make some money tonight.
Well, that's the Betmaker Show for now. We publish multiple times each week. We'd like to thank you for listening, and if you liked what you heard, please take a moment to leave a rating and review, or subscribe to our show feed, or share our show with a friend or two and help us grow the show. We very much appreciate it. Visit us on the web at betmaker.com. And reminder to sign up for the newsletter. Thanks to our engineer, Darren Vandermolen. and producer Mike Gallivan. The Betmaker Show is a production of Cardinal Marketing Incorporated. Betmaker is a registered trademark. Any rebroadcast, reproduction, or other use of this content without the express written consent of Cardinal Marketing Incorporated is strictly prohibited.
The handicapping and sports odds information contained on this podcast is for entertainment purposes only. Please confirm the wagering regulations in your jurisdiction, as they vary from state to state, province to province, and country to country. Using this information to contravene any law or statute is prohibited. The podcast is not associated with, nor is it endorsed by any professional or collegiate league, association, or team. This podcast does not target and is not intended for an audience under the age of 18. If you think that you have a gambling addiction, stop this podcast now and please seek help.
Gambling and betting on sports is a form of entertainment and should be about having a good time. But when done excessively, it may negatively affect other areas of a person's life, such as their physical and mental health, school or work performance, finances, and or interpersonal relationships. At Betmaker.com and The Betmaker Show, we're concerned about the addiction that gambling may cause, and for this reason, we encourage everyone to practice responsible gambling. An approach to gambling that helps you ensure that it remains an enjoyable activity. Here are the main principles of responsible gambling. Don't think of gambling as a way to make money. Always gamble with money that you can afford to lose. Set limits and stick to them. Never chase losses. Don't gamble when you're depressed or upset, and create a healthy balance. Always be aware of how much time you spend gambling or thinking about gambling. And do not allow gambling to cause you to miss out on time with family and friends or time spent on other activities you enjoy. By following these guidelines, gambling can be a good time and great entertainment. If you feel at any time that your gambling is taking away from important areas of your life, is causing you stress or depression, or is leading to financial losses that are beyond your control, please reach out for help. Learn more at responsiblegambling.org.